Tonight, I want to tell you a story about a woman who had forgotten how to see magic in the world and how one extraordinary encounter changed everything. Close your eyes and let me take you to a place where the ocean meets the sky, where lighthouses stand as guardians of hope, and where the most unexpected friendships can heal even the deepest wounds. This is the story of Eleanor and the lighthouse keeper who taught her that sometimes the light we're searching for has been inside us all along. Eleanor Martinez had been driving for 3 hours when she finally saw it. The lighthouse standing tall against the storm-darkened sky, its beacon cutting through sheets of rain like a sword of light. She pulled her car to the side of the coastal road, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. At 34, Eleanor felt older than her years. The last 2 years had been a blur of hospital visits, sleepless nights, and the slow, agonizing process of watching her mother fade away. The funeral had been 3 weeks ago, and since then, Eleanor had been floating through life like a ghost, unable to find her footing in a world that suddenly felt foreign and cold. Her mother's final words echoed in her mind. "Promise me you'll find your light again, Mia. Promise me you won't let the darkness win." But Eleanor didn't know how to keep such a promise. She had taken a leave of absence from her job at the marketing firm, sold her mother's house, and now found herself here at the edge of the continent with nowhere left to run. The lighthouse's beam swept across her windshield, and for a moment, Eleanor felt something stir in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months. Curiosity. She grabbed her jacket and stepped out into the rain. The path to the lighthouse was steep and rocky, but Eleanor didn't mind. For the first time in weeks, she felt truly awake. The salt air filled her lungs, and the sound of crashing waves seemed to wash away some of the heaviness she'd been carrying. As she approached the lighthouse, she noticed warm light glowing from the windows of a small cottage at its base. She knocked on the door, not really sure what she was doing or what she would say. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a man in his 70s with kind eyes and silver hair that caught the light from inside. He was holding a steaming mug of tea and wore a thick wool sweater that had seen many winters. "Well, hello there," he said. his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. You look like you could use a warm drink and a dry place to sit. I'm Thomas, and I suppose you could say I'm the keeper of this old lighthouse. Eleanor introduced herself, and something in Thomas's manner, the way he looked at her with genuine interest, without pity or judgment, made her accept his invitation to come inside. Thomas's cottage was exactly what Eleanor had imagined a lighthouse keeper's home would look like. Books lined every wall, nautical charts covered a large wooden table, and the smell of chamomile tea mixed with the faint scent of sea salt that seemed to permeate everything. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on photographs of ships and seascapes. I've been keeping this lighthouse for 43 years, Thomas said, settling into an armchair that was clearly his favorite spot. Officially, the Coast Guard took over the operations 15 years ago, but they let me stay on as a sort of unofficial guardian. I think they understand that some places need a human soul to keep them alive. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm mug he'd given her. The tea was perfect, not too sweet, with just a hint of honey. I'm sorry for just showing up like this. I'm not even sure why I'm here. Oh, but I think you do know, Thomas said gently. You're here because you're looking for something. And this lighthouse, well, it has a way of calling to people who are searching. Over the next hour, Eleanor found herself telling Thomas things she hadn't told anyone. About her mother's illness, about the guilt she felt for sometimes wishing it would end, about the emptiness that had consumed her since the funeral. Thomas listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making a soft sound of understanding. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman, he said finally, and she raised a remarkable daughter. But you've forgotten that, haven't you? Eleanor felt tears threatening. I don't feel remarkable. I feel lost. Lost, Thomas repeated thoughtfully. You know, I've met a lot of lost people over the years. This lighthouse draws them like moss to a flame. But here's what I've learned. Being lost isn't the same as being broken. Sometimes we need to be lost to find our way to where we truly belong. The storm had passed by morning, the small guest room Thomas had insisted she use. She had slept more deeply than she had in months, lulled by the rhythm of the waves and the periodic sweep of the lighthouse beam. She found Thomas in his garden, tending to vegetables that seemed impossibly lush considering their proximity to the sea. Salt-tolerant varieties, he explained, noticing her amazement. Took me years to figure out what would grow here, but persistence has its rewards. How did you end up here? Eleanor asked, kneeling beside him to help weed around the tomato plants. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling in the soil. I was a merchant marine for 20 years, traveled the world, saw everything there was to see, but I was running from something too. The death of my wife and young son in a car accident. I thought if I kept moving, the pain couldn't catch up to me. Eleanor stopped weeding, her attention completely focused on his words. One night, our ship was caught in a terrible storm off this coast. We were taking on water, and it looked like we might not make it. But then I saw this lighthouse beam, steady and sure, cutting through the chaos. It guided us to safety. After we docked, I couldn't stop thinking about that light. A week later, I heard the keeper position was open and I applied. That was 43 years ago. And the pain? Eleanor asked softly. The pain is still there, but it's different. It's different now. It's not something I run from. It's something I carry with me, like a reminder of how much I was capable of loving. And that love, it didn't die with them. It just needed a new way to express itself. As if to demonstrate his point, Thomas stood and walked to a nearby flower bed where he began deadheading roses with careful, loving attention. Every morning, I tend this garden. Every evening, I light the beacon. Every day, I choose to believe that what I'm doing matters, even if I can't see all the ships I'm guiding home. That afternoon, Eleanor was helping Thomas repair a section of fence when they heard footsteps on the path. A young man in his 20s approached, his backpack suggesting he was a traveler. He had the kind of restless energy that Eleanor recognized in herself. The look of someone searching for something he couldn't name. "Excuse me," he called out. "I'm hiking the coastal trail, and I wondered if I could ask you about the lighthouse. I'm a photographer, and I'd love to get some shots, if that's okay." Thomas invited him in for lunch, and soon they were all sitting around the kitchen table, sharing homemade soup and bread. The young man, whose name was David, explained that he was on a cross-country journey documenting lighthouses for a book project. But honestly, he said, his voice carrying a note of frustration, I'm starting to think I'm just running away from my problems. I graduated from college 2 years ago, and I still have no idea what I want to do with my life. My parents think I'm wasting my time with this photography thing. Eleanor found herself leaning forward. What do you love about it? The photography, I mean. David's face lit up. When I'm behind the camera, everything makes sense. I can capture moments that people might otherwise miss. The way light hits water, the expression on someone's face when they think no one is looking. It's like I'm collecting proof that beauty exists even when everything else feels chaotic. Thomas nodded approvingly. Sounds like you found your calling. The question is, are you brave enough to trust it? That evening, the three of them sat on the lighthouse's observation deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. David had his camera out, but he wasn't just taking pictures. He was fully present, experiencing the moment as it happened. You know what's funny? Eleanor said, surprising herself by speaking. I spent so much time caring for my mother that I forgot to live my own life. But watching you work, David, it reminds me that I used to love creating things too. I majored in art in college, but I convinced myself it wasn't practical. Thomas smiled. It's never too late to remember who you were before the world told you who you should be. David stayed for 3 days, and during that time, Eleanor watched him transform from a restless wanderer into someone who had found his center. Thomas had suggested he document not just the lighthouse, but the people who were drawn to it. Their stories, their struggles, their moments of revelation. On David's final morning, he showed Eleanor and Thomas the photographs he'd taken. They were breathtaking. Not just technically perfect, but emotionally resonant. He'd captured Thomas's weathered hands as he tended his garden, the way the lighthouse beam illuminated the fog, and a particularly stunning shot of Eleanor standing at the edge of the cliff, looking out at the ocean with an expression of quiet contemplation. I've never seen myself look so peaceful, Eleanor said, studying the photograph. That's because you are peaceful, David replied. You just forgot for a while. After David left, promising to send them copies of all the photographs, Eleanor felt a strange restlessness. She had been at the lighthouse for a week now, and while she felt better than she had in months, she also felt like she was avoiding something important. That night, she couldn't sleep. She climbed to the top of the lighthouse, where Thomas was adjusting the beacon. Can't sleep either? He asked without turning around. Thomas, can I ask you something? How do you know when you're ready to leave a place? He paused in his work and looked at her thoughtfully. I suppose you know when staying feels like hiding, instead of healing. Eleanor nodded slowly. I think I need to go back, not to my old life, but I need to face whatever I've been running from. And what's that? The fear that I'm not strong enough to build a life that would make my mother proud. The fear that I wasted years caring for her instead of pursuing my dreams. The fear that it's too late to become who I was meant to be. Thomas smiled gently. Those are all very reasonable fears. But you know what I've learned? Fear is just love in disguise. You're afraid because you care so much about honoring your mother's memory and living a meaningful life. That's not weakness. That's the most beautiful kind of strength. The next morning, Eleanor woke with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. She found Thomas in his workshop, a small building behind the cottage that she hadn't explored before. The space was filled with the most beautiful sculptures and paintings she had ever seen. Thomas, she breathed, did you make all of these? Haha, my evening hobby. After I tend the light, I come here and try to capture some of the beauty I see every day. My wife always said I had artistic hands, but I never believed her until I had all this time to experiment. Eleanor walked slowly through the workshop, taking in seascapes that seemed to move with their own inner light. Sculptures of driftwood and sea glass that told stories of storms survived and treasures found. In the corner, she found a painting that made her stop in her tracks. A woman standing at the edge of a cliff, her arms outstretched toward the sea, her face tilted toward the sky. That's you, Thomas said quietly. I painted it 2 nights ago, from memory. I hope you don't mind. Eleanor felt tears welling up. In the painting, she looked radiant, powerful, alive. Is this how you see me? It's how you are, Thomas replied. You just need to remember. That afternoon, Eleanor made a decision that surprised even her. She asked Thomas if she could borrow some art supplies, and for the first time in 15 years, she began to paint. Her hands remembered the movements, the way to hold a brush, the feeling of color flowing across canvas. She painted her mother's hands, weathered and gentle, holding a small bird that seemed about to take flight. I always loved her hands, Eleanor said, as Thomas watched her work. Even when she was sick, they were still beautiful, still capable of so much tenderness. You have her hands, Thomas observed, and her heart. Word of Eleanor's painting somehow spread through the small coastal town, and soon people began stopping by to see her work. Mrs. Chen from the local grocery store commissioned a portrait of her late husband. A young mother asked Eleanor favorite stuffed animal. Each request felt like a small miracle, proof that her art could bring joy to others. "I never thought of art as a gift before," Eleanor told Thomas one evening as they watched the sunset. "I always thought it was just something I did for myself." "Art is always a gift," Thomas replied. "The question is whether you're brave enough to share it." 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor's arrival, and she knew her time at the lighthouse was coming to an end. But instead of feeling anxious about leaving, she felt excited about the future for the first time in years. She had been researching art therapy programs, thinking about ways to combine her love of creativity with her desire to help others heal. "I want to work with people who are grieving," she told Thomas. "I want to help them find ways to express what they can't put into words." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Your mother would be proud." "I think she would be. And more than that, I think I'm starting to be proud of myself." Last night, at the lighthouse, Thomas gave her a gift that took her breath away. It was a small painting of the lighthouse, but unlike his other seascapes, this one seemed to glow with its own inner light. The beacon wasn't just illuminating the sea, it was illuminating a path that seemed to lead directly to the viewer. Every person who comes to this lighthouse carries a light within them, Thomas explained. Sometimes that light gets dimmed by grief, by fear, by the weight of the world, but it's always there, waiting to be rekindled. This painting is a reminder that wherever you go, you carry your own beacon. Eleanor held the painting carefully, feeling its weight and warmth. "Thomas, how can I ever thank you for what you've given me?" "You already have," he replied. "You let me remember what it feels like to watch someone find their light again. That's the greatest gift you could give an old lighthouse keeper." That night, Eleanor stood at the top of the lighthouse one last time, watching the beam sweep across the dark ocean. She thought about all the ships that had been guided to safety by this light, all the lives that had been saved by one man's dedication to keeping the beacon burning. "I understand now," she whispered to the wind. "We're all lighthouses. We're all meant to guide each other home." 6 months later, Eleanor stood in front of her first art therapy group, her hands steady as she prepared to guide 8 people through their own journeys of healing and discovery. The community center in her hometown wasn't as picturesque as Thomas's lighthouse, but it was filled with the same kind of hope and possibility. "Today, we're going to paint our lighthouses," she told the group, which included a veteran struggling with PTSD, a teenager dealing with her parents' divorce, and a widow who reminded Eleanor of her mother. Not literal lighthouses, but the things in our lives that guide us through dark times. As the group began to work, Eleanor moved between them, offering encouragement and gentle guidance. She thought about Thomas, who had become a regular correspondent, sending her photographs of his garden and updates on the travelers who still found their way to his lighthouse. David had visited him again, bringing copies of his published book of lighthouse photography. The dedication read, "To Thomas and Eleanor, who taught me that the most important light is the one we carry within ourselves." "What are you painting, Eleanor?" asked Marcus, the veteran who had been coming to group for 3 months. Eleanor looked down at her canvas, surprised to see that while she had been helping others, her own hands had been working. She had painted a bridge, not a lighthouse, but a bridge made of light, connecting 2 shores. On one shore stood a woman who looked like her mother, holding a small bird. On the other shore stood Eleanor herself, arms outstretched, ready to receive whatever gifts the future might bring. "I'm painting a connection," she said softly, "a reminder that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to flow." A year after leaving the lighthouse, Eleanor received a letter that changed everything. It was from a woman named Sarah, who had seen Eleanor's work at a grief counseling conference and had been inspired to start her own art therapy program for children in foster care. "Your story gave me courage," Sarah wrote. "When I heard you speak about finding your light again, I realized I had been hiding mine under a bushel for years. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to become who we were meant to be." Eleanor smiled as she read the letter, thinking about the ripple effects of kindness and courage. Thomas had helped her find her light. She had helped David find his purpose. David's photographs had inspired thousands of people to seek out their own moments of beauty and connection. And now Sarah was lighting the way for vulnerable children who needed to know that they mattered. "It's like the lighthouse beam," Eleanor murmured to herself. "It just keeps spreading outward, touching shores we might never see." That weekend, Eleanor made a decision that felt both spontaneous and inevitable. She packed her car with art supplies and drove back to the lighthouse, eager to share her news with Thomas and to spend a few days in the place that had saved her life. Thomas was waiting for her when she arrived, as if he had somehow known she was coming. His garden was more beautiful than ever, and the lighthouse stood as stalwart as always, its beam sweeping faithfully across the waves. "Look what I've brought you," Eleanor said, showing him photographs of her art therapy groups, newspaper clippings about her work, and a framed certificate recognizing her program as one of the most innovative in the state. Thomas studied each item with the careful attention he gave to everything important. "I'm proud of you," he said finally, "but I'm not surprised. I saw this future in you from the moment you walked up that path in the rain." "Did you really?" Eleanor asked. "Oh yes, you had the look of someone who was ready to transform. You just needed a safe place to let it happen." That evening, they sat on the lighthouse deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson. Eleanor told Thomas about her plans to expand the program, about the book she was writing, about art and healing, about the man she had met, a fellow artist who understood her passion for helping others. "And you?" she asked. "How are you, Thomas?" He smiled, his eyes twinkling. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm meant to do. Though I must admit, I've been thinking about writing a book of my own, stories of all the people who have found their way to this lighthouse over the years." "You should," Eleanor said eagerly. "The world needs to hear those stories." "Perhaps," Thomas mused. "After all, isn't that what we're all doing? Telling each other stories about how we survived, how we found our way back to hope." As Eleanor prepared to leave the lighthouse for what might be the last time, she realized that she no longer needed to come back to find her center. She carried it with her now, like Thomas's painting had promised she would. But she also understood that some places become part of us, woven into our stories in ways that can never be undone. "Thomas," she said as she hugged him goodbye, "I want you to know that you saved my life." "Oh, my dear girl," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved your own life. I just kept the light on while you found your way watched the lighthouse grow smaller in her rear view mirror, but she felt no sadness. She understood now that the lighthouse had never been about the building itself. It had been about the light, the hope, the reminder that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone. 3 years later, Eleanor stood at the podium of a national conference on art therapy, looking out at an audience of hundreds of people who had come to learn about healing through creativity. She began her presentation with a story about a lighthouse keeper who had taught her that we all carry beacons within ourselves, waiting to guide others home. The light you seek, she told the audience, is not somewhere out there waiting to be found. It's already within you, waiting to be shared. And when you share it, when you have the courage to let your light shine, you become a lighthouse for others who are still finding their way through the storm. In the audience, a young woman who had been struggling with depression felt something shift inside her chest. A man who had lost his partner to cancer wiped away tears and began to imagine picking up a paintbrush for the first time in years. A teenager who felt invisible in her own family made a mental note to sign up for an art class. And somewhere on a cliff overlooking the ocean, an old lighthouse keeper tended his garden and smiled, knowing that the light he had helped kindle would continue to spread, touching shores he might never see, but believing with all his heart that it would guide countless souls safely home. 5 years after Eleanor's first visit to the lighthouse, she received a call that she had been both expecting and dreading. Thomas had passed away peacefully in his sleep, his body found by a Coast Guard officer who had come to check on him after he failed to answer his radio. Eleanor flew across the country to attend his funeral, which was held in the small coastal town. She was amazed to discover that she was not alone in her grief. Dozens of people had come to pay their respects. Former travelers who had found refuge at the lighthouse, local residents whose lives had been touched by Thomas's quiet kindness, and even David, now a successful photographer whose work had brought joy to thousands. He collected lost souls, David said at the service, his voice carrying clearly across the chapel. Cindy helped them remember that they were never really lost at all, just temporarily separated from their own light. After the funeral, Eleanor walked to the lighthouse one last time. The Coast Guard had decided to automate the beacon completely, and Thomas's cottage would be converted into a small museum about lighthouse keeping. As she stood in his garden, now overgrown but still beautiful, she noticed something extraordinary. Growing among the vegetables and flowers were hundreds of small lights, solar-powered garden lights that Thomas must have installed in his final months. As the sun set, they began to glow, turning the entire garden into a constellation of gentle illumination. Eleanor smiled through her tears, understanding the message Thomas had left behind. The lighthouse would continue to guide ships safely to shore, but now it would also remind every visitor that we are all capable of creating light in the darkness, of transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary through love and dedication. As she walked back to her car, Eleanor felt a familiar presence beside her. Not Thomas exactly, but the wisdom he had shared, the love he had shown, the light he had helped her find. She understood now that death could not diminish the gifts we give to each other, the ways we change each other's lives, the ripples of kindness that continue long after we are gone. Thank you, she whispered to the wind, to the lighthouse, to the eternal mystery of human connection. Thank you for teaching me that the light was always there, waiting for me to remember how to shine. And in lighthouses and art studios, in gardens and museums, in conference rooms and quiet bedrooms where people listened to stories before sleep, the light continued to spread, touching hearts and igniting hope, proving again and again that love is the only force in the universe that grows stronger when it is shared. The lighthouse keeper's greatest gift was not the ships he guided safely to shore, but the souls he helped remember their own capacity for illumination. And that gift, like all true gifts, was eternal, passed from heart to heart, from story to story, from one generation of lighthouse keepers to the next. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May you remember as you drift off to sleep that you too are a lighthouse. You too carry within you the power to guide others home.